So I want to welcome everyone to our Omaha Table Talk series. My name is Candace Freeman. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Programs and Curriculum Manager here at IC. Before we would start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional homeland of the Native and Indigenous people who lived and took care of the land that most of us gather on tonight. That belonged to the Omaha, Ponca, Pawnee, Oda, Missouri, Santi Dakota Sioux, Kansas, Iowa, Cheyenne, and Ho-Chunk Winnebago people. We honor this with gratitude and pay our respects to all Native and Indigenous people. So hi, welcome to everyone today. This is our first conversation in our Native and Indigenous Table Talk series. I do want to acknowledge that it is Native American Heritage Month in the month of November, so it's completely fitting for us to have this conversation in this month. This year, we have a new partnership with Echohawk and Nicole to start our Native and Indigenous Table Talk series. We'll have focused conversations more specific to issues that are happening within the Native and Indigenous communities that may not be talked about often or explored. I want to thank all of you for joining us today as we embark on this conversation. I do want to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, the Logier Foundation, Cox Communication, and American Family Insurance. Well, I do want to introduce our moderator for this conversation, Echohawk Lefthand. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about and I hope I don't butcher the name, Nakoma Group, kind of what it is and how this idea came into fruition before we get started with our lovely panelists in the discussion that we're going to engage in today.
Okay, Shay Yaha Donna in Slindy Age Kazoan Slendo Kapan Hebash's chin, although a shade of Che Dokin the cheat, that's none out aid the Nensle. Although she's a Echohawk left hand inch, out aid the Nensle. Thank you. As I had just mentioned, my name is Echohawk Lefthand. I am a member of the Navajo Nation down in the Southwest, and I think inclusive communities and everybody online with us today to talk about mental health in Native American communities. And so I'll talk a little bit about NAGPOMA, but I also want to start off in a good way with a prayer. And so this is a positive acknowledgement that any journey or anything that begins, you always start with those positive intentions. And so today, I'll let him introduce himself, but one of our community members, his name is Stephen Tamayo. He'll offer an opening prayer for us. And so we're kind of sharing the same space. So we're going to switch places here.
So how many dakipi? I patikin le mechante ta wogla ke hanga pichis up. And macha si chango la kota chile tiwahi ta sapayo yonke. So my name's Steve Tamayo. I'm the cultural specialist for the Native Indigenous Center of Education here within the Omaha Public School District. And so my family comes from Rosebud, South Dakota. I am a member of the Burnt Thigh Lakotas. My family comes from a small community we call it Ta Sampayo Yonke. This is called Milks Camp. And so I want to thank you all for addressing this issue and this problem that exists, within all of our young relatives and in the communities of the unbalance that exists. And so I'd like to offer this blessing and this prayer. Sahamatakyupi. Achala wopila tanka achala oshimala yo achala makshari. Ese tukashila wakantaka achala tanya we chose an ikiucha or stay upila. I want to say a special blessing and a prayer once again for all of our relatives who suffer from a lot of the illnesses that exist from the pandemic and everything else that has affected the world. I'd like to focus specifically on the tacha achala chante Tawachi, Naha, Echala, Nagila. And so this is our body, our heart, our mind, and our soul. And so once again, we focus here within the school district to understand the importance of our self-identity, of our self-being, and understanding, the hardships that exist on the daily within our little relatives here within our communities and all over the country, all over Turtle Island. I said to Gashila Wakataka Chela Wopila Tonka Chela we chosen. I said, we'll check here. Che tate to go chako ste uplu. I said to Gashila Wakataka Chela Wama Kashkashka. I Chela Ushimalayo Mahyo. And so I want to say a special blessing once again for all of our relatives of the two-leggeds, the four, the winged, and as well as our water relatives. And we can never forget all of our plant relatives that we use in our we chose in our ceremonies. And so for me, we utilize, and understand the importance of that pejihota. And as well, that's our sage that we utilize, as well as our wachhaga. This is our sweetgrass, naha, echele chanli. This is all of our natural tobaccos that exist out there. Echele naha ki hante blaska ki. And so I also wanted to acknowledge that flat cedar that we utilize in our prayers and in our ceremonies. Say to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Wopila Tanka Chela Wocheki. I want to say a special prayer and a blessing to all of our little ones out there, all of our little boys and girls and teenagers, from the pre-K all the way up into our high school, as well as our adults. I say to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Wocheki, Chela Umspieki. And I want to say a special blessing to all of our educators, all of our staff members who are trying to maintain a somewhat normal lifestyle during this pandemic. I said to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Wopila Tanka Chela Kota Woglaki. I want to thank the Creator for us to still have and utilize our languages. I wanted to say a blessing for each and every one of you and for your family members and your communities. I said to Gashila Wakantaka Chela Wopila Tanka Mitakoye Oyase. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you. So I thank you, Steve, for offering that prayer. Each of our indigenous nations have practiced that for many generations. And so now you think about the science of positive affirmations in the morning and how that has been researched and been shown to, if you have those types of affirmations and positivity in the morning, it brings about a better day and a holistic sense of well-being and purpose. And it just kind of overall makes you healthier. And Native peoples have been practicing that with the rising of the early morning sun, or even the dawn before the sun comes up. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Stephen Tamayo. He's always a person in the community who's willing to help, where he can. And that was the purpose of NACPOMA, this Native American Community Partnership of the Omaha metro area. It's kind of a mouthful of words, but it's a group of organizations, and we're always looking for people to help. But these are organizations that serve programming or services for Native American peoples in Nebraska, in Omaha. And we try to get together and try to see what the needs and the gaps are, and then seeing what we can do together as a group to fulfill some of the needs of the community. And so in the early beginning, we looked at social determinants of health. And over the years, since 2019 is when this group first started meeting, we've narrowed it down to 4 priorities of mental health being, the biggest priority, and then followed by education, and then having a resource hub to have a place to where we can put all of the information and events and services for Native peoples, and then also community awareness in 2 fronts. One, to provide education for partners and organizations in the Omaha area on how to work with urban Native peoples. And then also providing education for our community residents. There's been a lot of, we'll talk a little bit about historical trauma today, but that's been detrimental in a lot of our ways of being, especially in our parenting styles and things of that nature. leading to a lot of the different disparities in mental health, emotional health, physical health, spiritual health, all domains of health. And again, I thank you, Inclusive Communities. My name again is Echohawk Lefthand, and I have a master's in public health. And so I am also the director of Indian education within the Omaha Public Schools. But I come to you today as just a member of the Native American community. I've worked with the Indian Health Service for over 10 years down in the Southwest. My focus has been suicide prevention. I was the manager of our meth and suicide prevention program, and then also helping to build coalitions and youth councils and things like that down in my part of the country. And so I came to Omaha about 6 years ago to work at the VA as a health promotion program manager, and then found myself being drawn back to the Native American community. And OPS has made an opportunity available for me to serve our Native American students. And so that's how I come to you today. And I also want to introduce our panelists, and I'll let them introduce themselves and kind of where their lens and then where they're coming from. And so I'll start off with Christina. I'll go ahead and have you. And then if you could just afterwards, just go ahead and I guess say that you are finished and then, go on to the next person. So Christina.
Thank you, Echohawk, and thank you everybody for coming here today. My name is Christina Ariano. I am Ute Mountain Ute and Peruvian, but I lived for many, many years on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota in a little town called Manderson, South Dakota. I am here because of lived experience. So I am not any type of clinician or medical doctor or psychologist, but I do have a lot of lived experience. I mainly focus on areas of suicide prevention and the LGBTQ plus communities. And with that, I am going to pass it on to Lestina to introduce herself. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. How mitakuyape. Greetings, my relatives. Tanya, Yahiba, Chante, Washteya, Nape, Chiyuzapi. It's good that you are all here, and I offer you all a heartfelt handshake. Me, Shnina Iokpia Wahie. Speaking for myself, I am very happy and honored to be here. My name is Lestina Saul-Merdassi, and I'm from the Sisseton or Sisitawa, Wapatawa, Dakota Oyate. I also have descendancy from the Ihunktawa or Yankton Sioux and the Isanti Dakota Oyate nations. So a little bit about me. I grew up in South Dakota. I currently work at Nebraska Urban Indian Health Coalition as a behavioral health counselor. I am not a licensed mental health therapist, but I have worked 6 years in the behavioral health field. Two of the 6 have been at Centerpoint here in Omaha, and the other 4 have been here at Nebraska Urban. I'm a licensed drug and alcohol counselor, and I'm also the project coordinator for Project Beacon, which seeks to address sex trafficking in Indian country. I also have a lot of lived experiences. Currently, I rely on a lot of Native mentors, whether they're elders in the community here in Omaha or whether they are in Minnesota or South Dakota. I rely on them for insight, and I try to look for cultural teachings and understandings to address a lot of our illnesses that we have in the community. In my Santee heritage, one of my great-great-grandmothers was a natural healer. So I feel like this is my calling. And thank you all. I'm honored to be here. I'll pass to John.
Hi, everybody. My name is John. I also came to Omaha about 6 years ago to go to college at Creighton. And then after I graduated, I moved back home to the Rosebud Reservation in South Dakota, where I worked with the state for about a year in child protection services. And then I moved into grant writing and program development for my tribe. Yeah, that's how I'm here today. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, panelists. And so to give a little bit of insight about the Native community before we get into our questions today, is that the Native American population, I think 2020 census is estimated to be about 10 million people. And if you break that down, that's usually about 1 or 2%. And so when you look at any population breakdown, whether it be the national level, state level, city level, that's about usually what we represent is 1 to 2%. And so within the city of Omaha, I think there's about 150 different tribes represented. And then within just in the district of OPS, there's 50 different tribes represented. But there's over 570 different tribes across the United States. And those are federally recognized. We also have some of our relatives who are not recognized, but are state recognized or just not acknowledged at all. And that's the result of a long history with the United States and colonization and things of that nature. And so many of our family members, we struggle with, it's particularly in the urban setting, sometimes with biculturalism, multicultural, ethnic culturalism. Many times, we are disconnected from our traditional ways of being. And sometimes we have that struggle, which leads to a lot of mental health and different things of that nature. And so just to kind of talk a little bit about, what we'll talk about today are just the perspectives of a few Native peoples, just to let it be known that there are, 570 other different perspectives that could be taken into consideration in terms of healing. And then also there's a little bit of, there's a little difference between our urban and our rural Native Americans in some instances, because in the 1950s, there was this relocation effort that was made by the U.S., which, forced a lot of our community members who lived on our reservations and pushed them into the city with a one-way bus ticket. And so in some instances, there's some disconnect in terms of knowledge of cultural identity, cultural practices, and what we do on a daily basis. And then also the responses in the city. Some of our cities, we had Indian centers. You go up to Minnesota, Chicago, there's an Indian center. Down in Lincoln, there's one that I think that's trying to gain some ground, but there used to be one there, but there's not one in Omaha. Although the Nebraska Urban Indian Health Coalition is working to try to create a center and where Native peoples can kind of come together. But here in Omaha area, there's not a Native American center like you would find in other bigger cities. And so with that, again, I welcome everybody here. And I look forward to all of the conversations that'll happen out in the breakout rooms. But I want to go ahead and introduce this first question out to our panelists. And we have about 5 of them here. And the first one is, how do Western therapy and cultural healing practices differ? What are some of the similarities and what are some of the differences? So looking at services and resources available, and I'll throw that out to the panelists. Kind of popcorn if you guys want to come off mute.
Well, I'll just say that I'll pass on this question just because I am not in that field. So there's my silence for this one.
Thank you.
All right. So basically, like with Western therapy, it's very education driven. Usually, like when you think of Western therapy, you think of having a diagnosis. And in terms of mental health, like the psychologist or a psychiatrist will want to diagnose you with a personality disorder or a mental health disorder and prescribe you medications to assist in you managing your symptoms. However, with traditional Native healing, we teach that, we've had our own forms of therapy. We've had our own forms of healing that existed for tens of thousands of years before modern medicine. So when we look at healing therapy, we look to our traditional ceremonies, whether that's inipi or whether that's practicing, our traditions, whichever are specific to your tribe. I can speak from my Dakota heritage. We use the Changleshka Wakan, which is the medicine wheel, and we rely on those teachings to heal us. And when addiction is persistent or is so existent in our communities. We teach the Red Road approach, which relies on our cultural teachings. So that's about all I have to say. I don't know if that answered all of your questions or if John has anything to add.
Yeah, I think just generally speaking, in the American healthcare system, we emphasize individual focused curative approaches, and that once you come in, you expect to have your systems managed and look for a cure. When I think looking at large scale disparities in Native communities, we're affected more by chronic conditions, and that kind of dissonance really doesn't frame healthcare as we understand it, typically in tribal communities, which health is a social experience and a community good.
Thank you. And then also just from my lived experience in working in suicide prevention, I think storytelling or just kind of oral stories about different illnesses and things like that kind of make a difference as well. In my experience with suicide, there's this misnomer of in Native communities to say that you don't talk about some of these things. And so, it wasn't a stereotype. And I started to ask my elders back home, and I started asking, how come people say you don't talk about suicide? How come people say it's scary and, different things of that nature? Was it always like that? Or, how did this being quiet, come about? And one elder had told me, he says, it wasn't always like that. He said, it wasn't always, but it's serious, when you think about mental health. He said that when somebody in the community says, hey, I'm thinking about taking my life, or I'm thinking about ending my experience in this earthly realm, he says that, they would tell the people, hey, don't talk about that. And because it's not like they weren't going to help, but they would say, hey, we're going to go into this ceremony. We're going to go into this ceremonial setting. We're going to go into this circle. And then within that circle, it just wasn't this medicinal healer or this medicine man or whoever that it might be. They would go into that circle, but it would also be the family and community members. And they would all go into this circle and they would sit there. And then there, within the safety and the sacredness of being in that circle, this person could express themselves because it was safe. It was kind of like a stronghold almost. And he said it was there that this person could talk about, well, this is why I'm thinking about ending my life. And then he said, then the people that was around there, he says, they wouldn't lecture. They wouldn't get after. They wouldn't berate this person. They would just kind of share their experiences through empathy and say, hey, one time I felt this way. I had this same experience, and this is how it affected me, and this is how I got through it. And so not only did it validate that person who is experiencing some of these mental kinds of, anguishes or grievances and things of that nature, but, it also brought healing, not only to that person, but everybody else that was engaged in that ceremony. And then through that, and then the healer or that medicine person or whoever that's taking care of it, then they would pray. They would extend out prayers out into the universe, out into the east and the south and the west and the north and up above and down below, all around, to kind of bring healing to this person. So it really kind of validated, the experiences that this person had, and kind of really, in terms of mental health, it really just, it made them feel like healed, I guess you could say. And usually some of these ceremonies lasted, some of them a couple days, 4 days, depending on the tribes and how they handled it. And he told me, he goes, how what's that difference? He says, how would a person feel leaving that type of environment, going out in the community, knowing, that this whole community kind of has his or her back, versus today, when someone says that they have these mental health, they go into this hospital or into these behavioral health things, and it's usually just one-on-one, just as John had talked about. How would that person feel? Or if it was just left at, you don't talk about it, just leaving it at that, leaving that stereotype, and supporting that, with not being able to refer to different resources and stuff like that. He says, our ways, it used to be powerful, and how we used to do things and handle and heal, because it was really that community piece that kind of came in to help everybody kind of be resilient. And now through different historical trauma pieces, it's kind of changed a little bit. And so, so thank you. I just wanted to add a little bit to that discussion about, Western therapy versus cultural healing. There's also this historical trauma that we're talking about, and I'm wondering if I could throw that back to the panel here to kind of talk a little bit more about it, in case some of our community members that are joining us are unfamiliar with historical trauma. So I'll open it up again for discussion.
Well, since nobody is unmuting, this is something that I think about all the time, having grown up in an urban setting and living on a reservation and coming back to an urban setting. You think a lot, or you hear a lot today about like mindfulness and sound alchemy and meditation and things like that. And people think that they're these new things, or they're only for Asian cultures. But if you really think about it in an indigenous way, we had our ceremonies and our own spirituality, and, sound alchemy is the drums in nature, and you have meditation, which is what people call like the vision quest, or seeking a vision, or your sun dances. So we've had these things in our history from the beginning of time, and in the old days, everything revolved around giving thanks and family and community and ceremonies for just about everything. You pick sage and you give thanks to that sage for being picked. And it seems like we have lost a lot of that. And a lot of that isn't, due to us just saying, go away. We went nearly 100 years without being able to practice any of our ceremonies or our songs or our gatherings. They outlawed pretty much everything that had to do with our culture in 1904, and it literally took an act of Congress in 1978 for us to be able to do these things again, to practice our ceremonies and our language and all of that. And I think it's kind of funny that they call it the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, but that's not a religion. It's us. It's our way of life. It's who we are. It's so deep ingrained in us that it goes beyond religion. And if you want to think about it that way, I grew up Catholic, so I'm going to use Catholicism as an example. So just imagine you being a practicing Catholic person, and this faith that you have is what grounds you and gives you hope and heals you from all the tragedy and pain. And then think about all of the ceremonies you practice as a Catholic, everything from Christmas to Easter to Ash Wednesday and Good Friday and all of that. Then imagine a group that is not part of you taking all of that away and saying that it is illegal for you to have Christmas, or it's illegal for you to go to communion, and think about all the saints that you wouldn't be able to pray to, or hymns that you wouldn't be able to sing, and not just you, but generations after you, not being allowed to do these things. And to me, that's how deeply I think about historical traumas, and that's how I like to explain it to people, is like, put yourself in that situation, just having somebody tell you that it is illegal for you to do everything that makes you who you are. And I'm going to step off that soapbox because I could go on and on and on. So.
So for me, I like to use the concept of the boarding school to illustrate historical trauma. The boarding school's motto was "Kill the Indian, save the man," and I feel like that's the whole emphasis of their plans. Like, to kill our culture was to kill whatever teachings or traditions we had and save the man, or make us to be who they wanted us to be. Another one of their teachings was tradition is the enemy of progress. That was another boarding school motto. And what they meant by that was like, our traditions were enemies to whatever progress they hoped to make by installing or instilling their Catholic beliefs or Judeo-Christian beliefs onto us during that era. I like to use the story of one of my ancestors who was brought through the Crow Creek Relocation Act from Minnesota as a little girl. She was taken there. I don't know, we don't know what happened to her parents, but one of them, her father is alleged to be Little Crow. And if you look back at his ancestry, there is an unknown little girl and an unknown little boy there. But that's an oral tradition that exists in my family. But the rest of the story is that once she got through Crow Creek and she came into Santee, she changed her whole name. They did that to hide her out for fear that they were going to kill her or anybody related to her, or find out who her relatives were so that they could kill them or destroy them because of their relation to this chief who was responsible for the Dakota Uprising. So when I think of historical trauma, I think of a trauma that was inflicted on all of us that made us fear speaking our language, acting out our traditions, and being proud of who we are. And it also took away our feeling of belongingness and acceptance, which are two vital things that we need, because those serve to perpetuate that feeling of community, that sense of community. And, you know, that sense of community and family was so big back then that, you know, you can even look at another boarding school picture and you'll see the teepees camped out outside of a boarding school in South Dakota because they wanted to be close to their children. And sometimes, you know, there's rumors that say those little kids died from broken hearts in the boarding school. So I think, you know, in terms of historical trauma, I want to say that it started in 1492 when Columbus, you know, landed here and started killing off tribes to gain their resources. So if you think of historical trauma, and for those of you that are non-natives that are listening, if you think of the events that happened at 9/11, you know, when they say the terrorists came here and blew up those buildings and there was thousands of lives lost. Well, that's what happened to us, except there was millions of lives lost. And sometimes I've heard people say, oh, you guys just need to get over it, you know, just get past that, you know, that's in the past. But you wouldn't go up to a 9/11 survivor and tell them, just get over it, you know, you need to forget about that. You wouldn't say that to them. So when you think of, you know, historical trauma or transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma, it's the hurt and the pain and all of that that's been passed down from generation to generation. And some of us are more conscious of it than others, and some of us, you know, don't understand, why am I so angry, or why do I feel that way? And they don't, you know, they don't understand the whole concept of things coming through the generations. But also on top of that, you know, we do have a lot of resilience in our structure, in our DNAs. Like, we are a strong people. We existed here without modern technology and all these modern day comforts for thousands of years. And, you know, we weren't destroying things. We weren't destroying the land. We weren't destroying our resources. So I think, you know, we have a lot of intelligence within us. We just need to get back to, you know, formulating that and back to living in our simple ways. And I think that that's going to be paramount to healing our generational traumas.
Mhm. So within historical trauma in relation to Canada today, how do you guys feel like historical trauma creates barriers, or how does it create bias in the Native American community in regards to maybe practitioners or providers when talking with Native peoples?
So if I can unmute myself and maybe just add some 2 cents in. I'm Officer Retina Alcantara with the Omaha Police Department. And I was supposed to be here with our co-responder, and she had another meeting to get to at noon, so she's not with me. But I think I learned pretty recently within the last few years about historical trauma. But when you call it historical trauma, it sounds like something that happened so long ago that we're not dealing with it today, but it's something that is today. It's a today trauma. And I think that many therapists, when we're looking in our European ways and our colonization ways of therapy and trying to work through events, because of historical trauma with the Native community, and I think historical trauma is actually something that affects a lot of other communities too. But I do see that there is a disconnect when it comes to therapy, because they're looking for what your trauma is right here, right now. And many Natives like me And when you're asking that question of, why do I feel so angry? What is this self-hatred that I have? Why do I hate being pointed out as the brown girl or the Indian girl? And all that, when you're from very young age to adulthood, finding your place in this world is a hard thing to do anyway. But then to come from this historical trauma background, coming from a Native background that you may not know much about, and not knowing how to use your own ways of coping because so many of those ways are lost. I think our therapists and stuff have a real disconnect with the Native community because they're looking for what's your trauma, but we're carrying a trauma from an entire generation and more beyond behind us. And it's something that I think is a big feat to be able to heal. And hopefully now that we're identifying these things, we're getting closer to finding ways to help Natives cope and help families cope together too.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important to note that historical trauma isn't something that is just happened in the past. It's very relevant today. In fact, the term historical trauma came from a study of the Jewish community after the Holocaust. And so there was a doctor who was studying, her name was Dr. Maria Braveheart, and she was looking at that community. And she saw that, through each generation, there was coping mechanisms, unhealthy coping mechanisms that were passed on from one generation to the next. And so as they kind of coined that term, they saw it very relevant to the Native American community. But any community or underrepresented minority group that has experienced some type of oppression does have, forms of historical trauma. Even our African American, Hispanic, Latino, Asian relatives, we all have some type of historical trauma, and that leads to some of the behaviors and unhealthy things that we do today when you think about mental health. And so thinking about bias, what are some of the biases that maybe some of our providers might have when engaging Native American communities? And I'll throw this again out to the group, the panel.
Hi, so I think some of the biases, I'm gonna share from some lived experience. This was at least over 10 years ago. I was seeing a Western Caucasian therapist, and I don't know where he was getting his information from, but when I presented for him, he automatically assumed I was from White Clay and Pine Ridge. And he kept asking me, how many pints of whiskey do you drink? When you were drinking, how much whiskey were you drinking? And at that time, first of all, I'm not from Pine Ridge and I'm not from White Clay, and I wasn't drinking whiskey, but he just kept asking me those questions and assuming because I was Native American that, for one, I must have been a whiskey drinker, and two, I must have been from Pine Ridge. And so after that, I never went back to him because he was too prejudiced and he made a lot of assumptions. And I think sometimes today too, people think that, we are always looking for handouts too, and that, we if we're Native, we automatically must be alcoholics, or we automatically must be living off the government. So I think those are some biases that exist. I also was thinking about what Officer Rutina said. One thing that therapists can keep in mind is that when their client presents, they're not just dealing with current day trauma, they're carrying around at least 7 generations of trauma. And in order to effectively help a person, I think you need to keep that in mind and also be aware of your biases towards different tribes or towards, different cultures.
Does anybody else from the panel want to add?
So Lestina, you and I seem to have a similar experience with mental health professionals. Mine, I went to see them for different reasons, but it seemed like they just kept coming back to being Native American and me being light-skinned. So if you saw my dad is very dark. My mom is German. So, I got the lucky German skin and things like that. And it always came back to, almost like questioning whether or not I was an Indigenous person. And it's like, that's not even what I'm here for, you know, it's not to question who I am culturally. I'm here for something else, but it seemed like it always came back to that. So like you, I just stopped going. You know, thinking about that, I would really like to see more Native people, more Indigenous people get into the fields of mental health, because I just thought of, sorry, I'm going to do a TikTok reference here real quick. I saw an interview with Denzel Washington, and he was asked a question as to why it was so important for a Black person to direct some film that he was in, and he gave this answer about color versus culture. And he said, you know, so and so did Schindler's List, and so did Goodfellas, and it would be easy to switch them back and forth, and they still would have been good movies. But it's culture versus color, and if we have more people who identify with our culture in those fields, then they would probably understand more of the things that we as Indigenous people go through.
Yeah, just to add to that really quickly, I think that lack of healthcare provider representation, you know, not having those employment opportunities filled by natives makes it easier for those providers to be ignorant of the lived experience, which makes any, you know, treatment and intervention plan unsustainable if you don't have like an idea of what home looks like. And that also, you know, contributes to non-compliance, whereas that if your provider is like ignorant of like, you know, your ability to pay for medication, that also just makes the illness much more challenging every day.
And so thinking about some of these healing mechanisms, I think we have about 4 or 5 minutes here left for our panelists, and then we're going to go to a group discussion. But how can we create some space for Native American Indigenous communities within the city that can help to uplift voices which aren't often part of these kinds of conversations? What are some ideas or suggestions that you have?
I think being supportive of events that student orgs put on, that the Native students like at UNO and Creighton, as a first gen college student, like that was my first time that I was able to meet other Natives. And that was the first time I'd left my reservation. So it was kind of a big shock, culture shock to, you know, enter a space that wasn't predominantly Native. So I think just being cognizant of when, you know, they have community events to be sure to attend those would be really helpful.
Thank you.
I would just agree with what John said. Just get more involved in your Native community. And if you see other organizations hosting events, or like NACPOMA does with all of these wonderful events that they have coming up, I would suggest just getting involved. Because I think, you know, going back to that sense of community, that's how we learn from each other, that's how we heal, and that's how we're going to grow. So I think coming together and sharing ideas or whatever it is will be beneficial to the whole community at large.
And I'll go ahead and piggyback off of those. So what I do as a profession is I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional. So I'm involved in a lot of different communities. So not only get involved, but if for some reason you see an event and you cannot attend, share it with your friends and with your family and with your social media, because if you can't go, you know, that doesn't mean that somebody else can't. And a lot of times it is the marketing of these events that, you know, you don't hear a lot about them. So I like to think of myself as pretty involved in communities, but I did not know about that organization, Echohawk, until you had mentioned it a few weeks ago. So, you know, it's using your voice to spread the word so that it just keeps going and people.
Thanks. I would also like to add just learning more about Native American communities. As I had mentioned, you know, there's over 570 different tribes. And so living here in the Omaha metro area, learning about the Indigenous peoples that reside here as well. Many times when you do a Google search, Sometimes I might be looking at different populations, looking at our relatives up in South Dakota, even down in the Southwest, Northeast, and sometimes it's not relevant. And knowing who some of these resources are in the community, I know that here in Omaha, it might be hard to identify, but maybe like POMA, one of our priorities is a community hub, whether it be online or physically in person somewhere, that would list all of the different organizations and resources that are available for Native peoples, but then also for organizations that are working with Native peoples to ask questions like, why is it that when I engage, a patient or a person that I'm seeing, why is it that, they have some of these barriers, and, what can I do to better help them? And a lot of it is just understanding. And so with the Native American communities, Lestina talked about the medicine wheel. The very first stage is just making Native people feel like they belong. Belonging and creating that rapport is something that's very, very important. Just like anybody else, if you don't feel like you belong, you're more hesitant to share and be a part of a group. And then after belonging is mastering, meaning whatever that you're trying to engage or whatever that you're trying to learn, this person has to, be right along. But the first stage has to be belonging, and then mastery, and then interdependence. That's kind of them being able to complete, some of these tasks or this understanding and hone kind of their mastery of it. And so, looking at belonging, mastery, interdependence, and then lastly, there's always gratitude. How do Native American peoples give back this knowledge that we have gained or attained, or, even through gift giving, some of those things, especially, Thanksgiving is coming upon us. It's a time for families to come together, even though it kind of came about on a historically kind of insensitive kind of note, things that have happened in the history. But there's always this time of the year that there's always gratitude given for the harvest, for the hunt, for, preparing to go into winter. And so families kind of use that today in some Indigenous communities just to see relatives and to come home and to be able to kind of, keep our internal fires bright and burning, you could say. There's a lot that we could talk about. And unfortunately, we're a little bit past 12, 25, 27, looks like now. We could probably make this a 2 or 3 hour all day kind of conversation, but I think we're going to go ahead and transfer into our breakout rooms, and I'll turn it over to Candace to go ahead and lead us.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Echohawk. Nicole had some great things in the chat, and then all the panelists and people who just spoke up and shared your experience and your knowledge. It was very valuable, so I want to thank you for that. We are going to go into our breakout room portion. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had some fruitful conversations in your table groups. We would love to hear some of the awesomeness that happened in there, some of the discussion that you all kind of engaged in. We will keep it a little brief, so I will go to each of the table facilitators and y'all can tell me who's sharing out for your group, and just maybe share 2 to 3 key points of discussion that y'all had. So we will start with Bradley's group.
It is Lily. She's we had a nice time figuring that out, but Lily will come in and summarize for our group.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Some of the things that we discussed were these unresolved emotions and thoughts about traumatic events, and these negative repeated patterns of behavior, including beliefs that people have held onto about parenting, for example, or lack of knowledge of how to parent. Sometimes, untreated or poorly treated substance abuse, or, severe mental illness that has come with that. And then the inability to use like traditional ways of healing, for example, when people are undergoing treatment. And there's also, we also talked about like parent-child relationships and, lack of emotional attachment. That's, I think, 3 of the points that we talked about.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, Lily, and thank you for that group for your conversation. I will go to Emily, who is the designated speaker for your group.
Well, we got a little cut off at the end, my fault entirely. I didn't realize we were ending early. So Raisa was going to speak for us. If she's still game, brilliant.
Hi, so we talked a lot about like what our main takeaways were from the panel discussion. And we pointed out that, you know, so much of how we view these discussions is rooted in colonialism. And so we talked about the importance of building services, especially mental health services, from within Indigenous communities, instead of using sort of like a top-down approach of starting with this really westernized, colonialized view of mental health care, and then chopping it up and piecemealing it out to Indigenous communities, and just sort of being like, this is what you get. And instead talking to Indigenous community members and building that from the ground up, and really incorporating the practices that they have in those communities. And then we were also discussing at the end, Ame made a really good point about the lack of knowledge and awareness of things that cause historical trauma. And especially because we talked about boarding schools. And so much of that is left out of educational settings. And I think a lot of that too is willful from the systemic point, you know, the systemic standpoint. So there are people in power who benefit from not telling these stories. And so by not insisting that children in all education settings learn these stories, we grow up in you know, especially in America, at like uneducated. And so it becomes harder to understand how that historical trauma has affected all of these systems that lead to oppression. And so really acknowledging that and being intentional about dismantling that is going to be really important for addressing especially mental health care for Indigenous communities. I think I covered most of it.
Thank you. That was some great stuff. So thank you all for your conversation. We do have about, say, like 3 or 4 minutes for maybe 1 or 2 questions. If anyone in the audience wants to ask any questions of the panel, or just wants clarification on anything that was discussed or wasn't discussed that you maybe have a question about, I will reserve some time now for that.
Can I add a few things?
Yes, please, Nicole, please go ahead.
I think so, and I kind of sent it to Echo earlier, but just understanding that we have a different thought process of how things are. So looking at like mental health as not something that is a sickness and a diagnosis, but like that it's unbalanced within oneself and figuring out why that is. But then also looking at a lot of what Western idea is, that is sickness and mental health may not be the same idea for us. You know, they could be gifts that were given to our community members and how they use them. And it even came up, you know, just talking about substance abuse and homeless. And I've heard 1,000 times that, you know, our homeless relatives, the ones that are suffering and that are carrying those burdens of our family members, are doing so that the other family members can continue to go on and thrive in life. And so just being aware of what your idea is or what your understanding of mental health is not the same for everybody. And that's just not natives. I mean, that's a very Indigenous thought process. And then also looking at when you're talking about like non-compliance with what people are looking at medical wise and healthcare wise, is that like I have, especially young people who are getting more culturally connected, they don't like to take Western medication. And so what does that look like for them? How do we accept that as saying, okay, they are doing something and they are taking the care steps that they need, but that they aren't being non-compliant in a way that we think they need to comply. And then it was touched on too, in like the lack of education, but like all of our systems that we have to live in the society are systems that were not they weren't built by us. They weren't built by the community members. They were built by those who don't identify the way we do. And so how do we figure out, like, it was mentioned before, is let us say what it is that we need. And I think that's especially when we talk about our young people, we talk about historical trauma, but it's very current, ongoing trauma. We look at Black Lives Matter, we look at Standing Rock in 2016. Even if our young people are not culturally connected or don't understand the traumas that their ancestors had kind of went through, they are very clear that they know who their people are, how they look, how they see themselves within those people. And so when you see it on the news, when you see people that look like you being treated certain ways, that resonates with them regardless of their cultural connection that they may carry with them. So just my 2 thoughts on it.
Thank you, Nicole. We very much appreciate your feedback, your experience, and your just knowledge as a whole. This time now, I will share out the evaluation link in the chat. If you get a free second, maybe just click on it so it opens up a window. If you have a few seconds now, please feel free to complete it. If not, we really do appreciate if you do. We strive our best to make sure that we make these conversations what y'all want to hear about. And we talk about topics that are important and relevant to you. So your feedback is important. I do want to also share out when our next conversation is in the Native and Indigenous Conversations series. And then Echo, I will pass it to you if you have any final thoughts before we close out for the day.
I just wanted to say thanks again to everybody who's on this Zoom table talk. I appreciate all of the panelists. I appreciate all of the people that are represented here today. I also wanted to leave an open invitation. You can email me, echohawk.lefthand@ops.org if you have any questions or anything like that. And then also we have a NACPOMA regular meeting next Thursday, or a week from today. So Tuesday at 1 p.m. And that we send that out virtual. And so we meet and we talk about some of the disparities and different things we can do. And again, our 4 main priorities right now is education, mental health, community awareness / education, and then a community hub. So if you're interested in participating, please let me know. And thanks again.
Thank you everyone for attending. Again, here's the QR code if you would like to scan that as well for the link, and then just our next 2 conversations. We do have a conversation November 30th, exploring the gender binary experience versus the trans non-binary experience. And then we have a QTT following in December, exploring some of the health disparities and healthcare for the queer community. So I want to thank all of you for spending your afternoon, morning with us, exploring this topic of health and mental health in the Native and Indigenous communities. And we really, really hope that you join us again for one of our continued conversations. So I bid you all